it's Laura Creative Twilight. Today I want to talk about miniature painting mistakes. There's a lot to learn with miniature painting, and it's easy to make mistakes if you don't realize you're making them to begin with. So today I wanted to go over some of the more common ones I see and give you advice on how to avoid those. The first mistake isn't painting itself, it's something related to painting. So when you start learning to paint, you're doing your thing, you're happy with what you're doing, and then at some point you see the work of another painter who's more experienced and just a better painter, and you get discouraged. And that can impact your desire to paint and just demotivate you. You just don't want to paint anymore. So when you look at the work of another painter, you should admire their work. You should let it inspire you. It should be something to strive for. You shouldn't get discouraged about what you're doing. The only way to become a better painter is with experience, practice, and pushing yourself. So don't look at the work of another painter and feel inadequate. Let their work fuel you, let it motivate you, let it push you to try to learn the techniques that they're using to create what they're creating. In the same vein, just enjoy painting. It's part of the hobby, it should be fun, so don't let it get you down. The next mistake is not cleaning your paintbrushes. So after every painting session, what you should do is you should use a brush cleaner and clean your brushes. The reason for it seems kind of obvious. It gets all of the crud out of there. There's always something that dries on there, even if you clean your brushes as best as you can. So brush cleaner will get that out. It will keep your brushes in the best working condition they can be, and it will make your job easier as a painter. If you don't clean your brushes, you're going to get a shorter lifespan out of them, and you're going to in turn spend more money. The brush cleaner I recommend is the Masters brush cleaner. It's extremely cheap. You can pick it up on Amazon. You can find it at some craft stores, and it's a lifesaver. I've been using this for a few years now, and the lifespan I've gotten out of my brushes just by using it has been amazing. I've also had brushes that were in really rough shape with dried on paint, stuff I use for really crappy jobs like dry brushing and stuff like that, and using this was able to get some dried out stuff that had been on there for God knows how long. So definitely make sure you're cleaning your brushes, pick up a brush cleaner, and it will save you so much money. The next mistake I see, this is more for new painters, but it's not priming your miniatures. So anytime you're going to paint a miniature, you need to prime it first. Acrylic paint is not made to stick onto the surfaces of plastic, resin, or metal. If you paint directly on a model, that paint will easily rub off over time, and it doesn't even take that long. It can rub off during the painting session itself. A primer, however, is made to stick to the model, and the paint in turn sticks to it. So by using a primer, you're getting a better surface to adhere the paint to, which in turn is going to give you less problems with paint rubbing off, as well as damage. If you drop your models, they're going to be very prone to chipping if you don't prime your models. But if you prime it, you're creating an adhesion, so things are going to be less likely to get damaged as well. So in the same vein as primers are sealers. Sealers or varnishes are clear coats you put on top of your models to keep everything in place. It helps prevent damage, chipping, scratching, things like that. You spend all this time painting your models, you get them to where you like them, you're happy with it, you don't want them damaged. So using a sealer will help prevent this. There's a couple of different ways you can go about this. You can use brush-on sealers, you can buy spray sealers. I personally use Tester's Dull Coat. It's easy to find in the United States. I believe it's harder to acquire in Europe. But it's a small can and it goes on extremely matte. The finish is great. I've used some others, I've had some pretty good luck, but that's the one I definitely recommend. But the point is to just take the time and put some sort of sealer on there to help protect your work. So the next mistake, I see this mostly with beginner painters, but I've seen some experienced painters do this as well, and that's just painting too thickly. So whenever you're painting, you want to thin your paint. You don't want to paint directly out of the pot if you're using Citadel paints, because you're not able to thin it. What you want to do, and I'll get to this after, is take your paint from the pot, put it onto a palette, and you need to thin it. To thin the paint, you don't necessarily need to mix in water or anything like that. What you should do is always paint with a wet brush. You shouldn't be using dry brushes to grab paint for a few different reasons, but one of them being that it's not going to thin the paint out. So put your brush in water, or when you're cleaning it off, wipe all the excess water off, but leave your brush damp. And then that's what you put into the paint on your palette to pick it up with, and then apply it to the model. Just by doing that, the paint will go on thin, and that's exactly what you want. If you come directly out of the pot, it's going to go on thick, it's going to obscure detail, it's going to cause all sorts of problems. So use thin paint, get yourself a palette, and it'll save you a lot of work. So going to palettes now, be sure that you're using one. I personally like using a wet palette. The reason I like a wet palette is it keeps your paint moist, it keeps it from drying out on you while you're painting, and it keeps your paint thin. It's also a great point to go from for blending because of this, because it keeps your paints thin and workable. It makes blending a whole lot easier. That was one of the reasons I started using a wet palette, but there's definitely that added bonus of the fact that you can paint for hours and your paint won't dry out. I've had paint on my wet palette for days and it's still workable. You don't have to use a wet palette, you could use a dry palette. The point is to use something that you can take the paint from the pot, or if you're using a dropper bottle, and put it on something. From there, you have more control over how much paint's going into your brush, as opposed to if you're just grabbing it from the pot. Now, this next subject or mistake is a very long one, so I'll keep it brief, and it's about paintbrushes. So don't buy really cheap paintbrushes. Don't go to Walmart, buy a 5 pack of paintbrushes for $5 and try to paint miniatures. Those brushes are not made to paint miniatures with. What's going to happen is you're going to get frustrated and aggravated because nothing is working right. The brush isn't holding up. It dies in a few days, a few weeks if you're lucky. And it's just an infuriating thing to deal with. So there's a few different options. If you're on a budget, I used to use Lowland Cornell and Princeton Art paintbrushes. Those I found to be pretty good. They'd last a few months. They were maybe about $3 a brush, and you can find them at most craft stores pretty easily. You can also use the Citadel liner brushes. Those are pretty good. I still have a few of those actually. I don't recommend buying their Artificer liner brushes, those are overpriced. I've also heard good things about the Army painter liner brushes, and those are pretty inexpensive as well. So those are kind of your mid-tier brushes. If you are looking to spend a little money, then I would recommend the Raphael 8404 liner brushes or the Winsor Newton Series 7. Those are tried and tested by lots of painters. They come highly recommended, and I definitely recommend the Raphaels. The next mistake, and it's with paintbrushes as well, and I see this a lot even with experienced painters, and that's using the wrong brush for the job. So every brush should have a job. You should have a brush for base coating, a brush for layering, a brush for fine detail and edge highlighting, and the reason being is some brushes are just better at the job than others. A base coat brush is going to get damaged. You don't want to use an expensive brush for that. You don't want to do layering with a fine detail brush because it's going to take you forever. So you want to use the right brush, and you want to use an appropriately sized brush. If you're dry brushing, you want to have cheap brushes that you don't mind getting damaged that you're going to use for that, and only use those brushes for that. It's going to increase the life of those brushes as well because it's doing what it's intended for. You're not using it for things that you shouldn't be doing with it, so those brushes are going to last longer for you as well. Continuing with the brushes thing is don't use brushes that are worn out. Every brush has a lifespan. Even expensive brushes wear out. Brushes will wear out, the bristles will become frayed, they won't stay to a point, maybe the bristles will fork, things like that. When your brushes do that, stop using them for any delicate work or things like that. Brushes like that can become base coat brushes, they can become dry brushes, but if your fine detail brush isn't holding a point, just stop using it. I used to use brushes way past their expiration date, and it was just frustrating. Trying to do freehand work with a brush that can't hold a point is just aggravating. And every time I'd buy a new brush, and I would just kick myself for not having done it sooner. We all hate to spend the money, but it's going to save you a lot of time and effort just by replacing those brushes, recognizing when they're worn out, and just delegating those to more abusive tasks. This one's aimed more at new painters, but the mistake I see are people who don't use washes. So a lot of beginner painters will paint things, they'll just base coat them. They won't highlight them, they won't shade them, it's just base coat and done. Now that's fine if that's what you're aiming for, but I definitely recommend using washes. They're affordable and they just make things look better. Washers are very easy to use, you just brush them over the areas and let it settle into the recesses and it'll create shading and in turn highlighting for you. It's a really simple thing you can do and get a lot of impact from. Something else, and this one is aimed more at new painters, but it's also aimed at, I've seen some veterans who do this, and it's general improper model preparation. So if you're getting a model that's resin, you need to wash it with warm soap and water before you primer it, before you paint it. If you don't, your paint won't stick at all, your primer won't adhere to it, and it's just a nightmare to deal with. Along the same lines of improper model preparation would be not cleaning mold lines. Mold lines are those seams you see from the casting process on a model. Take the time to clean those off. Use a hobby knife, it's really easy to scrape off, and it just looks better. I've seen some amazingly painted models that had mold lines on them, and it just looked horrendous. It didn't matter that the paint job was done so well, those mold lines just stuck out like an eyesore. Something a little different now, and something I'm very guilty of, and that's poor ergonomics when painting. So it's kind of like computer work, right? If you're sitting at a desk for long hours at a time, which many of us do with miniature painting, you need to try to adhere to some sort of good posture. You need to keep your back straight, you need to keep your head forward. Ideally, you need to place your elbows on your painting table, and that puts your miniature at eye level. This does a few things. Not only is it good posture, but it also helps steady your hands while you're painting, especially if you're doing fine detail work, if you're doing freehand work. I know a lot of people suffer from tremors and things like that, and they just don't have a steady hand. So propping your elbows up on the table will really help steady that. And again, it's just good ergonomics. It helps keep you going. It allows you to paint longer. The last mistake I'm going to cover, and we're all guilty of this, and that's painting with a goal of perfection. So if you set out with the goal of painting something perfect, you're probably going to let yourself down. We all make mistakes. Rarely does a model come out exactly how we envisioned it, but that's okay. You need to just let that go. Instead of spending excess time on a model trying to hit that perfect mark, just move on. A lot of times if you go back to a model that's not quite right but still looks good, you're just going to mess up what does look good. So just set it aside, be finished with it, take on a new project. When you take on a new project, you come into it with fresh eyes. You can learn from the mistakes you made on the past project, and you can apply that to this project that you're currently working on, and just move forward. It's the best thing you can do. Spending time just dwelling on something that didn't come out right, it's not going to get you anywhere. The best thing you can do is practice and get experience, and the only way you're going to do that is by moving on to new projects all the time. So that's all I've got for today. Hopefully I've helped some of you out. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't. If you have any questions or comments, definitely leave them below. As always, keep painting, and I'll catch you all later.